NACDL is the association of the nation's criminal defense bar.
So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for once again attending this virtual discussion series. My name is Monica Reed. I have the pleasure of serving as the Director of Advocacy for the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. And again, this race and criminal legal system discussion series has been highlighting just how race intersects with various issues in our criminal legal system. Today's webinar is going to focus on, it's a part 2 of discussion that we started a few weeks ago on race and collateral consequences. So if you were able to join us about 2 weeks ago, you heard from Cynthia, Roseberry, Rob, David, and Quentin, all who shared their expertise and insights around race and the collateral consequences and really helped to lay the groundwork of the discussion. And so today we are going to be continuing that conversation. We have a new group of panelists who will be sharing their expertise and highlighting a few specific industries as to the impact of collateral consequences. We are definitely excited to be able to facilitate and bring this conversation to you during April, which some of you may be aware, we've been recognizing as Second Chance Month around the country since, I guess, 2017. And so we're just joining in and increasing that awareness and just bringing attention to the obstacles that the over 70 million Americans with a criminal record face. So today's conversation is going to be moderated by Robert Patillo. He is a board member for NACDL, and he serves as the executive director for the Rainbow Push Atlanta Peachtree Street Project. But before I turn it over to Robert, who is going to further introduce the rest of our panel, I want to go through a few housekeeping items. So because we're still in this virtual landscape, we do encourage you to utilize our chat to introduce yourself, your organization, and where you're from. If you want others to see your message, make sure you indicate it in the 2 bars so that it will be seen by all panelists and attendees. We ask that you direct your questions to the panelists using the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We apologize in advance if we can't get to all the questions. These conversations tend to generate a lot of conversation and questions. But at the end of the discussion, we will share the panelists' contact information. So if you have any other pressing questions, you can feel free to reach out to them directly. And Robert, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Monica. I'm Attorney Robert Patillo. As Monica said, I'm a board member of the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, as well as a radio show host on News and Talk 1380 WAOK in Atlanta, as well as executive director of the Rainbow Push Coalition Peachtree Street Project here, headquartered in Atlanta, Georgia. And also do TV and a bunch of other stuff. I think all of us have crazy CVs by this point in life, but it's an absolute pleasure and an honor to be allowed to moderate this session. I'm going to kick this one off a little bit differently because I want each of our panelists, when I introduce you, to give a couple minutes of what got you in to this field, into this area of second chances, of addressing collateral consequences, and the kind of the cassia belli for what caused you to create this as a passion project. So joining us today, we have an esteemed panel. We have Mr. Tracy Syfax, we have Ms. Cassandra Frederique, and Mr. Kevin Garrett. All joining us for this discussion. So I'll start with you, Tracy Syfax. What got you interested and passionate about the field of second chances and collateral consequences?
Thanks a lot, Robert, and thank you, Monica, and thank you, NACDL, for allowing me once again to join the conversation. So yeah, Robert, my entry into my life calling, my purpose, was my introduction to the drug war back in the 80s. I'm one who spent 17 years, not only as a drug dealer, but as a drug user to support my habit. Ended up spending about 7 years in prison. And upon my release in 1993, just made a vow to myself I wasn't going back. And since then, been able to create a couple of $1 million businesses. But what I learned when I was in prison was that some of the most talented, innovative, creative people I ever met, I've met in prison. So knowing that talent is there, I wanted to take what I learned in entrepreneurship and give that back. That's my life purpose and that's my calling.
Thank you so much for that, Mr. Syfax. Cassandra Frederique, You are the executive director of the Drug Policy Alliance, a national nonprofit that works to end the war on drugs. How did you find yourself in this field of addressing collateral consequences and trying to beat back much of what happened during the war on drugs?
Yeah, so thank you so much. And thank you for everyone for taking some time to be here today. I think for us at the Drug Policy Alliance, one of the things that we've realized is that we cannot end the drug war without looking at the various ways that the drug war has infested other systems. And we actually are moving away from using the language collateral consequences, because these are intentional policy choices that were made by this is not like secondhand harm. This is actual policy choices that different systems have taken on to bar and to target people who use drugs or who sell drugs or are drug involved. And so for us, I think our work was really recognizing that in order to end the drug war, we had to comprehensively look at the harms and impacts of the drug war. And that by focusing on these things and getting people to understand the intricacies of how comprehensive the drug war is, then we could fully have a conversation, not just about how we end the drug war, but also how do we get reparations for the drug war. I think folks, a lot of times people, when they're thinking about reparations, they're thinking about folks that have been incarcerated, and that's very much true. And I also think that people that are getting their kids taken away, that have been deported, that have been evicted, that have been barred from getting employment, also deserve some repair. And so for us, I think it's about seeing the full breadth of the drug war and the full scope of it in order to effectively fulfill our mission, which is to end it.
Absolutely. Tracy Garrett, you have spent time on every side of the law, from incarceration to law school. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey and why you have decided to devote your life to this field of addressing the intentional policy decisions that resulted in the overcriminalization of many populations?
Thanks for having me, Robert, and it's great to meet you all out here on this very important issue that needs discussing. For a long time, people just would not. People who knew that the system was wrong, that it was broken and was not working, just would not. So it's an honor to be a part of this. I too, like Tracy, spent a considerable amount of time incarcerated. And one of the big things that I immediately recognized in the Texas prison system, which at the time, and if I'm not mistaken, it probably still is the largest prison system in the entire United States. One of the things that I immediately recognize is that, wow, we are continually building prisons and building prisons and building prisons, but there is no system, there are no programs, there's nothing to help a person on the backside when they get out. So I also noticed a lot of people, like Tracy pointed out, there are a lot of people that are really good people in prison. I mean, there are some too that need to be there, but there's some really good-hearted people there. There are some really talented people there, really intelligent people there who were just not given a legitimate opportunity to participate in the American dream. And I noticed that a lot of people had substance abuse and or mental health issues that were entirely unaddressed in the system. And so that's what initially started my interest. How I got involved in the law, I had to be candid. I had a criminal defense attorney who was just not willing to go to bat for me. The only thing he was interested in is a plea bargain. And so I started going to the law library once a week and reading up on the cases. And I would just write anybody that would listen, prosecutors, my lawyer, judges, senator, anybody that would listen. I would just started that process. And it was at that point that I realized if I don't become an active participant in my own recovery and doing something about this system, it's not going to happen. And so that's what got me started in this work.
Absolutely. And I want to circle back around to Cassandra on this point, because you talked about that not being collateral consequences. This means the way the system was designed. And that struck me because the system is not malfunctioning. The system is operating exactly as they wanted it to. Can you talk a little bit about those policy decisions and how we go about turning those back into a more humane system of criminal defense, criminal prosecution in this country?
You know, I really appreciate the coming back to this, because I think oftentimes one of the things that I think as advocates is that this is being done to us, right? And so if we know that it is being done to us, it's not, it's something that can be corrected or stopped. And part of the reason why I really push on this frame around the intentionality of these policy choices, it's not like, you know, we created these mandatory minimums. And then because we created these mandatory minimums, all of a sudden, all these other policy choices were had by all these other systems. It was that the people in housing said, okay, now I'm watching them create these mandatory minimums. And so now we are going to decide, if the society decides that we have to lock these people up, then we decide that those people don't deserve housing. And then child welfare said, well, then we decide that those people can't be parents. And then, you know, SNAP decided, now we decide those people can't eat without getting a drug test. And so for us, I think part of the conversation is recognizing that our efforts have to be way more comprehensive, because the system has created an interlocked apparatus that people are having to navigate. And so oftentimes, you know, when we're in the criminal justice space, folks are like, you know, I do criminal justice reform work. And then some people say I do reentry, but that reentry work is also criminal justice reform, because the reasons why we're having to build out reentry infrastructure is because intentional policy decisions have been made in order to continue the criminalization and the punishment and surveillance of people who are no longer incarcerated. And so it means that we have to stop siloing ourselves and creating a gradation of harm, and recognizing that this is all harm, because it is the violence associated that people experience from incarceration to deportation to getting their kids taken away to not being able to provide is all violence. It's all harm. And we have to really recognize that in order for our strategies to be as effective, then that we need to be talking to one another about how we uproot the assumptions that is underlying all of these issues. So very much so, COVID-19, when folks were pushing for decarceration, rightfully so, there were so many people that were like, these people are gonna leave and they have no place to go because there's no housing. And they won't be able to provide for themselves, and there won't be any food. And, you know, and then some of us were like, well, they can't stay inside, they have to get out. But it was also like, but we as a movement, we haven't seen the full spectrum of the harm, and we're all working in silos. And so the intentionality is comprehensive, and therefore the intentionality of our advocacy has to be as comprehensive.
Mr. Syphax, you mentioned previously, one, your work with the Obama administration on reentry programs, but also some of the rights that you lose as a former offender. Can you talk a little bit about what those consequences are and those list of rights that you lose, and then what you have done trying to bridge that gap between persons who are reentering and the business and entrepreneurship field?
Yeah, so trying to close that gap, and I agree 100% with Cassandra with everything she said. Yeah, so those intentional consequences, there's over 50,000 of them. And we talked about those, and Cassandra knows those, you know, everything from not being able to transport bingo chips to not being able to raise cattle. Some of the most foolish and ridiculous laws that's been ever put on books have faced those that are coming home from prison. But you know, like she says, it's a multi-pronged approach. And what I believe, and the lane that I operate in, is through the economics. You know, I mean, the economics of incarceration and what that means for people that are coming home that can't get a job, can't get housing, can't be fed, can't be educated themselves. How do we begin to move from that? So a couple of things that I believe in as a 27-year entrepreneur is that, you know, everything that I've learned to do over my past, years being home since 1993 revolved around building an economic base, building something in the same community that I hung out with, and building that base, and then showing those same people in my neighborhood how we began to build an economic base through entrepreneurship, through home ownership, through real estate. You know, we recognize God is not creating any more land. So we must own a piece of that. And we must own a piece where we live at. My office is located on Martin Luther King Boulevard, just like any other Martin Luther King Boulevard across the country. We have our challenges. But the fact of the matter is, the same corner that I sold drugs in. It's the same town that's 7.5 square miles that I own close to $2 million worth of real estate. This is how we began to build that economic base through entrepreneurship. And like I said in the beginning, I believe that's my lane. As Cassandra said, it's such a wide spectrum approach of problems that we face, not just as formerly incarcerated people, just as Black folks. And then on top of that, we have this scarlet letter of that conviction and that C on our forehead when we enter back into society. So many ways that we have to attack this problem. And for me and for what I've been able to do over the past few decades has to deal around entrepreneurship and building that economic base.
Absolutely. Mr. Garrett, you talked a little bit about how you have addressed this issue, how you attacked it by one, becoming active in your own defense while still going through the process, but then also by graduating, magna cum laude from college. Can you talk a little bit about that process and some of the hurdles that they put in place after leaving custody and then entering the academic world?
Absolutely, Robert. That's a great question. In the academic arena, unfortunate as it may be, that was one of the only areas where I was fully accepted, not because of my race, not because of my age, not because of my economic situation, not because of my former incarceration, anything. That was the one area that I found immediately where my collateral consequences were not biting me in the butt like they had been with housing, employment, and everything else. And so I began my academic career as a personal gratification thing, because that would have made me the first generation of college graduates in my family ever. But once I got into the college area and I started seeing that all it takes is, and all that's expected of me is to show up for class and do the work. And I started seeing the competition around me, these other pre-law students who had no background, whose father or grandfather or uncle or aunt was a judge or some, prominent person that sat on some school board of trustees. They were pre-law students and they were like destined to go to like these first tier law schools. And I thought to myself, something is wrong with this picture. Something is wrong with this picture where I've served my time, and yes, I'm still on parole, but I've served my time. I'm out. I'm not breaking any laws. You have no problems taking my tax money. I'm paying taxes, but I'm relegated to a level of the highest I can aspire to is to be a truck driver, really. And so I took it as a personal quest, and I had a lot of very, very fortuitous things that happened along my journey that helped me to get into law school. But I always say this on these panels, whether or not a person has a legitimate opportunity to make it should not be dependent on luck. But with my situation, I had my mentor's mentor was a he was a retired federal judge. There was a friend of mine that I knew she was a teacher, but I found out later she was a law professor. And I asked him just point blank, I was like, look, my story, I have a past, but I'm doing really well. I get straight A's in class. I'm killing them, in the classroom. What do you think my chances are? And the retired federal judge is like, son, you just go for it. All they can do is tell you no. And so that's what got me going there. But the collateral consequences of it, my situation was because Texas has certain rules that basically preempt a person from even studying law. So I couldn't even be accepted to a law school in Texas. I had to go to a law school in a neighboring state while I was still on Texas parole because of that rule that preempted me from even studying here. But I went through that process and I came back and I took my my mentor's advice. You know, when he told me to go for it, I said, you know what? I just made up in my mind that I'm committed to this and I'm going to find out. I'm going to go as high as I could possibly go until I bump my head on that proverbial freaking glass ceiling up there. I'm just going to keep going and I'm going to keep going because somebody needs to hear this. Somebody needs to see this. And this can be used whether I get in or not, whether I graduate or not, whether I pass the bar or not. This can be used to elevate other community members, their thinking and ways to break out of that system. There are ways out. It's just that we all just have to work together to be able to do it. And having panels and discussions like this today is a great move forward. I just hope that we continue to be able to do that and get more people really involved in that.
And sticking with you, Mr. Garrett, because you talked a little bit about the fact that you're an outlier, and that the people on this panel, for the most part, are outliers when it comes to the people to individuals who formerly were incarcerated. What barriers need to be moved out of the way to turn this from being the exception into the rule, where people can make mistakes when they're younger, but then have the opportunity to get an education, have the opportunity to get bank loans, buy houses, those sorts of things. What can we do from a public policy standpoint in order to make that way smoother?
Remove those barriers. I mean, we just have to chip away at it. I mean, anyone that's worked in the policy field knows that things don't happen overnight. You may get a law that passes overnight, but it's going to take a lot of us working together. And I always like to say it's very important to point this out. Although it was the system that got me, you know, caught up in everything, I too was a player in that system. And there are many others who are players in that system because they get released and they either reoffend, recidivate, or they go on to have somewhat successful lives and they just turn a blind eye to everything that's going on with the system with everybody else. So for me to remove those barriers, like I said earlier, I just had to go for it. And I had to show people, you know, when I mentioned earlier that it was very fortuitous, you know, a pathway for me to get into law school. The people that I befriended along the way in that journey were really, really high level decision makers and things like that. But I had to show them by my behavior that people can change. People can change and people do deserve opportunities, you know, and these opportunities should not be doled out and they should not be handed to a person like on a stick, you know, like little puppets and stuff like that. You know, I had to do my part. That was my part, is I had to show them by my behavior. So my first, let's say 10 years or so after I was released from prison, you know, I had to show my community that I was worthy of an opportunity, that people can change, and you give us a chance and see what we can do. And you just keep pressing forward with that.
And on that same note, Mr. Seifetz, Tracy, one of the issues that I've had with previous clients, for example, is that they'll get released, they'll start working or they'll start a business because they can't find employment. But then they run into that proverbial scarlet letter, as you said, where now you want to expand the business, but you can't get a loan from a bank, or you don't have collateral. As soon as someone finds out you're a felon, you can't get hired on as a subcontractor for, you know, they were building the new stadium in Atlanta. One of my clients wanted to be hired on as a subcontractor with his company, couldn't be hired on because of his previous record. What do you say to individuals who are trying their best, but still bumping their head against that glass ceiling?
No, that's a good question. And I just want to just real quick before I answer that, just touch on what Kevin said, because I think it's very powerful. The power of example is a powerful tool. And Kevin has, you know, shown that and demonstrated. So folks see him and know that they can aspire to that. It's the same thing with me with entrepreneurship. You know, I made history in 2011 as becoming the first African-American to be ever awarded Entrepreneur of the Year by the Princeton Chamber of Commerce. I'm from Trenton, and they've never honored the African-American in their 51-year history. But I was also the first formerly incarcerated person to win that award also. So that's what I say about the power of examples. I just wanted to add that to what Kevin was talking about. That's a powerful tool. We have to be the example for those formerly incarcerated and those that are coming behind. Now, to answer your question, so folks that are going into business, one of the things I talk about in this entrepreneurship game is that a lot of folks that are formerly incarcerated, they didn't aspire to be entrepreneurs. Some of us are forced to be entrepreneurs when we don't have a choice. We're not going back to jail. That little minimum wage job that we work in is not paying the bills, but I'm not throwing bricks at the penitentiary anymore. So I'm gonna sell some clothes out the back of my car. I'm gonna do incense and CDs and oils or whatever. We do what we need to do to make sure we stay out of prison. So also the barriers. Now I'm gonna give you an example of how this whole thing works. I have a brother who started a training business when he came home from federal prison. Great business, clients, training. I think he had like 27 clients. When the pandemic hit, he could not apply for PPP because he had 3 years left on his parole. That's the type of things that we have to go through as formerly incarcerated people. But on the flip side of that, we're working with our congresswoman here in New Jersey to make sure that even the banks, because on the application, it didn't have that on it. This came from TD Bank. TD Bank had their own barriers for people that are formerly incarcerated to get loans through the PPP. Not just the SBA, also some of the banks had different criteria also. So we have to work with our politicians. We have to work with our Congress folks in order to address those laws and break those barriers. And those are the barriers that we face. And like I said earlier, it's not just as formerly incarcerated people. It's just as Black folks, period, trying to get a loan from a bank.
It's interesting you say that. There's the new Marvel series. One of the key points is Captain America comes back from fighting Thanos and can't get a loan from the bank. So it's not just the formerly incarcerated, it's the Avengers also. For Cassandra, on working specifically in drug policy, what are going to be the next steps as the nation? We're seeing marijuana legalization sweeping across the nation. Oregon has decriminalized mushrooms and other formerly controlled substances, but at the same time, it's not as if everybody who was in jail for that previously either A, is being released, or B, is able to enter those fields. What is the drug policy or the reform policy that can help bridge that gap?
So I think, for drug policy we are in this moment where a lot of laws are being shifted. And I think the marijuana legalization bills that you saw in 2012 are not the same marijuana legalization bills you see in 2021. So in the beginning, there was a lot of just legalize it and we'll figure it out. And now people are paying more attention to, well, we can't just legalize it and because if not, capitalism is going to do what it does and white people are going to do what they do, right? And that is keep Black folks out and Indigenous folks out and Latinx folks out. And so what you're seeing now is this concerted effort to pay attention to what the industry looks like and make sure that people who have had previous convictions around drugs are able to be a part of the market. And so there's a lot of emphasis on that, a lot of emphasis on trying to get directly impacted people. There's emphasis on trying to get community reinvestment from the tax revenues. But the truth is that we are operating under the same system that makes it really difficult for people to get regular loans for a restaurant that has nothing to do with cannabis. And so we're trying to create a new industry under the same system that has oftentimes created the conditions for people to sell drugs in the first place. And so there's a lot of struggle with that. I think for Oregon, where they actually decriminalized all drugs. So all drugs for small possessions have been decriminalized. And they also work to create legal access to mushrooms for therapeutic reasons. I think what you're going to see in the drug policy reform movement is we're going all in on decriminalization. So the focus is to remove criminal penalties and civil penalties for drug possession. I think you're also seeing the conversations that we're having, which is how do we decriminalize systems and decriminalize health? So the idea that people don't have to get incarcerated in order to get access to treatment. The idea that people should not be incarcerated and they should not be criminalized when they go to the hospital, that people who have been incarcerated should have access to housing. I think one of the biggest reforms that we could do for people coming home is make sure that people aren't barred from housing. It's so difficult for people with criminal justice histories to rent an apartment, buy an apartment, be housed in public housing. There's so many different ways. I mean, I think the effects of a drug felony conviction are enormous when it comes to basic needs that people have. Like, you can't get food stamps when you leave if you have a drug felony, and it's only for a drug felony, right? There are particular ways. And so our work is really about decriminalizing systems and the substances, but really towards an eye of decriminalizing communities. And I think one of the things that's really important is that, the number one arrest in this country is drug possession. And so really, if we're having a conversation around policing, if we're having a conversation about the funding for policing, if we're having a conversation about how do we really remove law enforcement from our everyday lives, you have to focus on drug possession charges. But also, if we're looking at the federal system, most people that are in the federal system are in there for sales. And so for us in the drug policy space, it's really having the conversation about people who sell drugs. And there are people who sell drugs because they are supporting their habit, but there's also people who sell drugs for the economic reasons, right? Like, they didn't come from a broken home. They just want sneakers and they just want cars, right? And that's about not being able to be a part of the above ground economies and job markets and being able to flip the skills that they have and be a part of a different market. And then we punish them for that. And I think that at the root of this conversation around drugs is about economic justice, right? It's about health justice. And so I think for us, it's really figuring out what are the underlying assumptions around criminalization, but also what are the underlying barriers that make these choices rational for everyday people.
And sticking with you, Cassandra, on that point, because I had Freeway Ricky Ross on my show a couple years ago. I got a signed copy of his book. And for those of you who don't know, Ricky Ross, not the rapper Rick Ross, he's the real life individual that was based off of, was one of the fathers of crack cocaine in Los Angeles. And he spoke to me about the fact that they could not have done what they did without the complicits or without the government being complicit in it. That they weren't flying any planes in Central America. They didn't have a laboratory somewhere in Compton testing different compounds. But it brings to mind the question of where should the reform take place? Because there's a lot of focus on the federal level on getting federal laws pushed through. But in places like Baltimore, we're seeing the Marilyn Mosby decide not to prosecute minor felonies, prostitution, drug possession. We're seeing in Los Angeles and in New York that happening. So where should we be focusing our efforts on reforming some of these depilatory laws?
Everywhere harm is happening. I think there are multiple actors. This system is so pervasive and so destructive because there are so many different pillars that are upholding it. And so we really need people to recognize that it's your city councils, your county legislators, it's your prosecutors, it's your state legislatures, it's your ballot initiatives. But also, here's the thing that is super, super important. It's your family. We hold each other to the highest standards that are often unforgiving. So, I'm from New York, and so we're still mourning one of our favorite deacons, Earl DMX Simmons, who had an outpouring of love when he passed away. If we had a modicum of the love that Earl Simmons was shown in public, in our families, in our homes, that's also part of the work. And so I think that it's important for us to really figure out like what are the conversations that we can have at the different levels. But I think there's a lot of work for us to do inside of our communities. The crack jokes, they're not funny. The jokes about prison rape are not funny. Like, there are real things that we have to do within our community in order to create the momentum and the ability for us to make the systematic change. We really need to look at the systems of our homes.
And Mr. Kevin, I found it striking a couple weeks ago when they had Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, doing a book tour for the new book that he has out. And he talked about his crack addiction that he had for years, where he said, you know, he would dig through the carpet smoking Parmesan cheese or whatever he could get a hold of. But he was treated with a level of grace and compassion and understanding that I feel is often missing in African-American communities when they're dealing with very similar issues. What is the conversation we need to be having, as Cassandra said, at home in our own communities about reentry, about rehabilitation, about welcoming people back into the family and not simply treating them, as Tracy said, as having a scarlet letter?
Yes, absolutely. And that's a great question. And just to piggyback back on what Cassandra said, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, it all my whole turnaround in my life, my awakening to these systemic issues we have, to my own health issues, mental health, substance use issues, and stuff like that. It all began with me as an individual. And from there, it built outwardly. So I went from myself as an individual and then to my household. You know, I became more aware of my part and the role that I play in my household, and the family dysfunction that I grew up in. When I realized, whoa, that I played a part in that, perhaps I could play a solution in that. And then it expanded even further to a community level. And that's where it all starts. I mean, we've got to address these things in terms of Hunter Biden being able to speak about these things and to be received so well and everything, while at the same time other communities cannot. I mean, those are areas that I have to grow in personally as an individual, and our people, our communities, we do. While I was with the Texas Jail Project a couple of years ago, I wrote a piece called Tough Love. And it was basically an essay on enlightening families on the harm that they are creating when you try to beat a family member into treatment, you know, or tell them, you know, stop using or get out, you know, stuff. That tough love, that's such an oxymoron. You know, what we end up doing is running people the wrong way instead of embracing them and embracing what's going on as a problem and not something that's wrong with the person. That's what the issue is right there. One of the main reasons why I think Hunter Biden, and this may just be me, why I think that he got such reviews is that's the difference between how our society operates today. We have been at such a place of divisiveness, especially over the last 4 years, and I don't have to say any more about that, where it's always a us against them type mentality. You know what I mean? And it's not an us against them type of mentality. All of us are all in this together. We're all in this together. It's an us against humanity type of problem. That's what it is, and we need to start addressing it as such. You know, the substance use issues, all the things that Hunter Biden talked about and everything he talked about so candidly and I'm sure eloquently and everything, they're no different than what goes on in each and every single solitary community. We need to get off of that BS and quit trying to make it out to be a Black problem, or you know, or only goes on in those neighborhoods, an economic problem, so on and so forth. It's an us problem. Something is wrong with us as a society. Something is wrong with us systemically. While we keep having these issues and we keep revisiting these issues over and over and over, and we need to get it together, and it all starts with me. So I hope that answers the question.
Absolutely. And going over to Mr. Syfax, before we go to some of the Q&A questions, I did have a question. One, how did you make all that money? And then two, how can we replicate that throughout other communities, including me? Because yeah, it's a lot of money.
I'm a serial entrepreneur, and I tell people all the time, you know, I remember selling drugs here in New Jersey and being high and getting high, running to New York 2 or 3 times a day, staying up for 3 or 4 days a week. I mean, 3 or 4 days in a row. So I remember those days very clearly, and I never forget those days. And I will never forget those 7 years I spent in prison behind it. I'll never forget that year in solitary confinement that I spent behind it. So I hustle hard. The bottom line is people always ask me, what's the key to success? The key to success is that you just got to work for it. So the same attitude I had selling drugs I have now. I run multiple businesses. I managed to do a lot of things at the same time and juggle a lot of things at the same time. And I also teach entrepreneurship twice a week to juveniles in the justice system here in New Jersey. So I keep a busy schedule, but I kept a busy schedule on the streets. So there ain't no difference.
Look, as Jay-Z said, I'm a hustler, baby. I can sell water to a well. So understood. Go into some of the Q&A questions.
I'm a businessman.
Not a businessman. Let me handle my business, man. Question directly for Cassandra. Do you see the decriminalization of drugs as a trap? People may not go to jail for possession, but you can't get hired because you can't pass a drug test.
I don't see it as a trap because the thing that I started off is that we can't just decriminalize drugs, right? Because it's not just about arrest and incarceration. It's about all the other systems that have made intentional policy choices to target people who are drug involved. And so as we work to decriminalize drugs, we're also working to remove drug testing as something that would impede people from getting access to resources. And so one of the things that I would offer as a resource to folks is this initiative that Drug Policy Alliance published in February called Uprooting the Drug War, which goes through 6 different systems. And it shows all the ways that shows all the intentional policy choices that were made in those systems that make it hard for people to survive. And so drug testing comes up in multiple systems, in employment, in employment, in child welfare, employment and child welfare, and in schools as well, in education. And so if you're doing the work effectively, I think one of the things that's super important is in a state like New York, where we just legalized cannabis. 2 years ago, we got rid of drug testing for parole and probation in the state of New York. And we also got rid of drug testing for pre-employment for private and public sector. Because we understand that decriminalization as a praxis is not only solely for the system, not solely for the drugs, but for the systems that people operate in. That criminalization is the strategy that is used not just in our criminal justice system, but in our schools and different places. And so it's really important as we build campaigns and as advocates build campaigns that they think about all the places that people engage with criminalization and recognize that their campaigns have to use all those different, have to work towards all those different things. And even if you're not doing it, you need to partner with other groups to do that work while you do the thing that you're doing.
Going over to Kevin, to Mr. Garrett, you talked a little bit about being an advocate for yourself, kind of going to bat for yourself as for your own legal defense when you did not have anybody in your corner, so to speak, speaking up for you. What should be the role of criminal defense lawyers in reforming this system and in beating away some of the collateral consequences that come along with either drug conviction or drug plea? 90% of cases plus end in a plea deal often, but we don't think about the collateral consequences that happen thereafter, or the intentional choices, as Cassandra would say, that are a result thereof.
Yes, great question. I think the criminal defense lawyers play a huge role. In fact, I don't think she would mind me sharing this, but I won't say her name. But my criminal defense attorney from 2006 actually offered to get me into rehab after I got out of jail. It didn't have anything to do with my case, the adjudication of my case for which she was representing me in. She offered to get me into rehab after. That just blew my mind. Ever since that point, Robert, she and I have been good friends. She has been a strong supporter of me throughout my legal career endeavors. I mean, she's written support letters. She represented me in one of my hearings to get licensing to become an attorney. And she's a great friend of mine now. She epitomizes what the code of ethics for lawyers means when it says zealously represent the client. The problem that we have now, that I've seen, at least that I experienced, is that most of the lawyers, not all of them, I mean, excluding this woman, but the majority of the criminal defense attorneys that I've had on my case, they've just been pencil whooping the paperwork. You know, they just basically wanted to get me to plead out as soon as possible without any type of counseling, any type of conversation, or even asking me what I thought about accepting such a plea. You know, no one, not a judge, prosecutor, no one told me about the collateral consequences that was going to happen later on. No one admonished me that if I accepted this time, yes, I might serve 5 years on a 25-year sentence, but for the remaining 20 years, you're going to have a lot of trouble getting housing. You're going to have a lot of trouble getting employment. My lawyers never told me that. That's the role that I think that the criminal defense attorney can play in changing the system as it is. Be a partner with the client and ask them, I mean, take time to ask some of those more personal questions, like the attorney that I referred to earlier did. She asked me questions like, were you getting high? What were you on? And I thought, that's insane. This woman is not asking me, do I want to accept the 2 years or accept the 3 years? She's asking me about personal things, about my health, about my substance use issues. That's the role that I think criminal defense attorneys can play, is to take a little bit more time, a little bit of extra time to partner with the client and see what's really going on. It could just be an issue that the client is having with their family, you know, and maybe they got caught up in the wrong place at the wrong time, because that does happen. You see, that actually does happen, but it could be something a whole lot more deeper that's going on that could be resolved without being adjudicated through the courts. If that criminal defense attorney would just take a little bit of extra time to partner with the client and find out what's really going on to zealously represent that individual.
All right, and sticking with you, I want you to kind of dig into that piece a little bit more about the things that you wish they had told you beforehand, and how that would have influenced how you proceeded, well, whether going to trial or taking a plea. Because, you know, in many states and jurisdictions, they give you a piece of paper, you have to go over with your client, explain all the rights you're giving them, you kind of speed through it, initial everywhere you can before the prosecutor changes their mind, turn that plea paperwork in and try to get out the courtroom as fast as possible. Talk a little bit about the information that you needed as a client, as a defendant, and making an informed decision.
Well, I just mentioned one of them is knowing the full picture. I needed to see a full picture of what was going on, not just how much time that I was looking at. I mean, I can add, you know, if you tell me I'm going to get 25 years in 1992, I can add real quick, and I know when I'll eventually get done with this. But letting me know everything that's going on, letting me know, you know, what my employment prospects are going to look like, you know, asking me questions like, where do you live? What neighborhood do you live in? What's going on that's causing these issues in your life that's making you keep getting these drug charges and reoffending, you know, things like that. Just, I mean, and I'm not by any stretch of the imagination advocating for lawyers to also become social workers, but at some level they actually are. We all are, whether we're lawyers or not. I think, going back to one of the previous questions, I think that's what's wrong with our society today. We have lost the capacity to actually care about people. We are so inherently selfish and laser focused on us, me, and what I need to do that we forget that our neighbor next door could be and probably is going through something that I could help with. Lawyers could be that type of person. Like I said, that the person I referred to before, that I won't mention by name, she is a great friend of mine. And all of that friendship started just from her asking an extra question that had nothing to do with my court case, just to care.
And going back to the Q&A, going over to Tracy, we have a question. A former client who was on death row for 30 years and was granted clemency 7 years ago. Hopefully, he will be granted parole this summer. And after being denied 3 years ago, any suggestions for him on how to re-enter?
I think number one thing is, if someone coming home from prison, the number one thing is to find employment. I think we have to start there to give someone opportunity to provide for themselves. And being locked up 30 years, I can't imagine him having to come home and reintegrate back into society. But I think also when we look at people that are coming home from prison, especially after spending 30 years, I think we have to look at the traumatic experiences that one faced doing 30 years in prison. That's not an easy task, and sometimes we begin in the community to normalize trauma. And that's one of the things we got to stop doing too, because when you look at ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, talk about all the trauma experiences I faced. I had an ACE score of 7 by the time I was 18. Child separation, foster care, parents divorced, my only brother tragically killed in a truck accident. So many ACEs by the time I was 18 that I had to deal with throughout my life. So we have to begin to deal with the traumatic experiences that we face in our community just growing up as a young man. We normalizing funerals. I was attending a funeral the other day, and I come out in the parking lot, and this is why the family was going into the church. I had to leave early, but while the family was going into church, 8, 9 guys, this is a young man that got killed, 8, 9 of his friends in the parking lot, drinking up, hanging out in the car, smoking. This is a church parking lot. We have normalized these traumatic experiences so much, whereas that we have become numb to them. And I think one of the things we have to realize is that growing up in the inner city, coming home from prison, spending 30 years in prison, we all are dealing with some traumatic experiences that we have to heal from. And we must begin to have those conversations around that.
Can you talk a little bit for the people on the call who don't understand how release and re-entry works? How does the process go? Many of us, we see the movies, they open the door to the jail, there's a gate there, you walk out, but take us through the actual process of how that works so people can better understand.
Well, I think one of the number one things once a person gets out, and pretty much the way you said it, it's pretty much the way it happens. With no very limited resources on where to go, where to get services. I think Cassandra was talking about how some of the policy has to meet of what's actually happening on the ground in these communities. I can give you a prime example. During COVID, here in New Jersey, we got a couple thousand folks released from prison. Once again, Department of Correction wasn't talking with community mayors and service providers in those communities. And we had to go to the train station to catch people getting off trains into our community with khakis and a white bag coming into the community, and direct them and provide them with the right services and where to go and where to get help. This is when the Department of Corrections is not even talking with the towns where folks are being released to. So once again, there has to be a coordinated effort of everybody working together. But when I came home from 1990, I came home in 93 now, just if you remember. We wasn't talking about reentry when I came home. We were just coming out of the get tough on crime 80s. So coming home now in 2021, I can say number one, that it is better. We're talking a lot different now than we was talking in 1993. So I think he has to, number one, connect with the proper services in that community and family support. I think Kevin mentioned this. We have to begin to embrace people and not push them away. I had support when I came home from my family that helped me cope with a lot of things that I had to cope with when I came home. And I think we all need that family support. And if we don't have that family support, guess what? We need to provide that community support.
Absolutely. Cassandra, I saw you wanted to chime in there. So I'll turn the floor over to you. Then we have a question directly for you.
I think one of the biggest things that I would say to what Mr. Syfax said is the entities that are criminalizing us are working together. It is a seamless process. When, as criminal defense lawyers, when you're getting the jacket on the person that you are defending, you're seeing a lot of cross collaboration across multiple agencies. Like the people that are trying to criminalize us are talking to each other. And I think it's just systematic and intentional that the people trying to, that our side are not set up to talk to each other, that we're not set up to share information. We're not set up to look at it wholesale. But the opposite, but the opposition is, they're all talking to each other. All the agencies are talking to each other. All your neighbors, everybody's talking to each other in order to incarcerate our folks, in order to criminalize folks. They have multiple ways for you to be able to tell on each other or get someone in trouble. And there are not multiple ways for people to get help. And I've always thought that was super interesting. And I think it's important for us to think about, because often as an advocate, even when I'm trying to provide support to someone like Mr. Garrett, defense attorneys don't really like advocates because if I want to highlight Mr. Garrett's case, defense attorneys have to think about his freedom and how to navigate Mr. Garrett inside. And so it's difficult. So there are barriers for us to even work together. But I think it's important for us to actually name that and see the different ways that we can actually disrupt it.
And so I know I said I had one question, but there's going to be a couple questions for you. I've had situations before where a client will be arrested for a drug charge, and I tell them, well, go to rehabilitation first, just so we can show to your, one, to address whatever issue you have, and then two, so that if we do come to a plea, we can show to the court you're taking personal responsibility, and that you're working on these things without the court, and hopefully that will be better later on down the lines. And I've had prosecutors try to use that as an admission of guilt to a drug charge. We end up with a place where, how can we work on getting to a place where we're working synergistically all the way across the line, from the defense side, from the prosecution side, from the social worker side, from the criminal justice system side, for the best interest of the individual and society at large, and not simply on trying to lock up the most people possible?
So this is a thing that is a real problem for me. I don't believe that the court system should have anything to do with health, period. I think this is like one of those catch-22 situations where folks are like, people are using people's ability to make decisions about their own health and their own autonomy as leveraging chips in navigating a racist and carceral system. So if, I'm arrested on a drug charge and I'm using drugs, but I don't want to go to treatment, to me, it goes against health for the attorney to use my potential participation in a treatment facility as part of my legal defense, right? Now, I understand that those are the strategies that we need to operate in the system. But as someone that's working on the decriminalization of substances and decriminalization of health, I think it's important to recognize that part of using that as a legal strategy strips the determination of your client, right? Unless that person is saying, I'm having a hard time getting into treatment, then why are those people being forced into treatment? And then of course the prosecutor is going to use it against you because they set it up that way. It's a catch-22, right? Like, it's BS. And so I think for me, part of the conversation, and this is someone who is not a lawyer, right? Like, I am literally not a lawyer. I'm a social worker. So for me, what I would say is, one of the things that we're working towards in our advocacy is to disrupt the relationship between treatment and the court system. We think that people should have access to treatment if they want it. And they should have access to treatment if they want it. And people should not be incarcerated because they don't want to take treatment. And that, to me, as defense attorneys, is one of the things that we have allowed because we saw it as a potential pathway for freedom. But the thing is, treatment can be as carceral and as stigmatizing and as violent as incarceration if we're looking at the ways that people are being harmed. And so we really, 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 as criminal defense attorneys, really need to think about how we use treatment as a part of the legal strategy, because it is dehumanizing, disrupts self-determination, and is going to be used against you anyway. So why are we doing it? Unless your client is saying, I have a hard time getting into treatment and I want to go to treatment today, not because you've told them that it will make it more lenient, but because they want to go to treatment, right? I think there's a conversation here to be talked about that. And I'm open to other folks challenging that, but I think it's really, really important. Drug courts don't work. They should be gone. There should not be a relationship between health and the criminal justice system. Everyone, you know, this point that we made about police doing so much stuff, part of that is because we've divested from the people that should be doing that work, right? Part of that is because the health infrastructure has been so starved that we're giving police more and more things to do. The court should not be a part of treatment, period. Because the thing is, treatment doesn't influence the criminal justice system. The criminal justice system influences treatment. The influence only works one way.
Absolutely. And Kevin, I saw you wanted to chime in, so I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Yeah, thanks. I just had a comment about the question on reentry. I think there's a gentleman that just got clemency and is a candidate for parole, I think, or something like that. I just wanted to clarify, and I've seen this time and time again with individuals I've worked with and through my own personal experience as well. Reentry actually begins from day one of incarceration. That's when it should start. To drop somebody off at the bus station and say adios, that is a recipe for disaster. I guarantee you, even if that person has housing, even if that person has employment prospects and all these things that most people re-entering don't have, that is a recipe for disaster. The plan and the planning process should be, like Tracy said, it should be a collective effort by all the key players that are going to be dealing with the person re-entering. It should be a collective effort, and it definitely needs to start ahead of time. I didn't start getting a measure of success with re-entry until I got fully engaged in my release process before I got released. And I see that time and time again, and I mentor guys that same way. I mean, if someone asks me for my advice on that, if they think they're going to be released within the next year, start reaching out, start writing letters right now, start getting in contact with people. Try to find somebody who's like you, who's been through this process before, or at least someone that has experience in working with someone in this process. Because like I said, the day of release, that is the wrong time to start trying to talk about reentry on the day of release after you're getting the person out.
All right, we're gonna got about 30 minutes left, so we're going to start going through these Q&A questions a little bit quicker. For Mr. Syfax, regarding Mr. Syfax's reference to normalizing trauma, what suggestions do you have for community level solutions to disrupting this intergenerational pattern?
I think number one, we have to begin to have those conversations through forums like this and mediums like this, where we begin to talk about it. Like I said, it's very rarely that we're having these conversations in a lot of circles that I've been traveling. And I just think it's time that we begin to have these conversations. When we start talking about mental health, drug abuse, all those things that we face here in America, we criminalize all that. We criminalize mental health. So we'll criminalize anything that we could criminalize here in the United States. And that's what we continue to do. So as you know, the number one mental hospitals in the country, in America, is jails. So we've criminalized everything. So I think once we begin to have these conversations about the traumatic experiences that folks like myself that grew up in the inner city and grew up in the urban area, we'll continue to go down this road. But I think it starts with a conversation. And once we begin to bring this and inject trauma into the conversation, that's when the healing starts. I'm 58 years old. I didn't deal with my trauma until I was in my 40s. So, my stuff should have started, back when I was in prison. So yeah, I think we start early and we begin to work on it.
And kind of just an open-ended question. Anybody feel free to chime in from here on out. We had a discussion a few months ago, and this was also dropped in the chat about how exactly do we deal with some of the external effects of drug use related to home invasions, crimes, those sorts of things. And I had a string of cases where I had a bunch of 14, 15, 16-year-olds all coming into my office for robberies, drug cases, gang cases, so on and so forth. And it was consistent for about a year. We sat down and talked to each of them. Every single one, as Tracy has referenced, had gone through some sort of trauma, whether it was a divorce in the family, the death of an aunt, the change in family circumstances. But for some reason, in poor communities, and particularly in African-American communities, mental health for young people is not a discussion that we're willing to have or willing to have a real conversation on. They don't get that same humanization that other groups have, where you can be psychologically traumatized. How do we begin to reform the system to reflect the need to address those mental health issues, particularly in youth, before it escalates to the point of dealing with reentry? And again, that's open for anyone who wants to hop in.
I think, Robert, I think the first thing is the school to prison pipeline. That I mean, I'm sure you've heard about that. You've worked around that. You just talked about some individuals you encountered that were teen youth. Man, when a kid gets in trouble at school, you know, that's a behavioral issue, right? That's a behavioral issue, and it's highlighted. Somebody took notice of that right away. You know, to start enforcing these really strict punishment measures at that point, that's sending them down the wrong path. That's kind of like enacting that tough love that I talked about earlier as an oxymoron. What it boils down to is it's the behaviors. The behaviors are always going to show up first. The behaviors is a symptom of something that's going on deep inside the individual. We as a people, as a community, especially people of color, we need to stop turning a blind eye to these behaviors. We see these behaviors all the time. We see them all the time, and we turn a blind eye and say, well, not my kid. Thank God that's not my kid. But we turn a blind eye, and it's like we don't acknowledge that behavior that could have been addressed early on in abatement, some type of treatment, something could have started right there at that point, rather than letting it just go on and go on and go on and go on. And then when they end up in the courtroom or they end up in the prison system, we say, oh my God, there's a problem. Well, there's always been a problem. We just didn't pay attention to it. The behavior is always going to show up first.
For Cassandra, there's a question directly to you. Do you believe that there is an underlying assumption that Black people are inherently dangerous, and that this assumption is the foundation for the disparate treatment by the criminal justice system? If so, how do we change the narrative?
Yes. Policing was created to protect property and to catch enslaved folks who ran away from their the people that were owning their bodies. And so I think that there is an underlying assumption that Black people need to be controlled, and that we are dangerous, that we are not to be trusted, and also that we can't make decisions for ourselves, that someone has to make choices for us. And so I think that that is an underlying assumption of most of the systems in this country. This country was built on anti-Blackness. I would say how to change the narrative. I think there are multiple things that we could be doing. I think white people need to teach white people about anti-Black racism. I think there's a lot of work that we need to be doing in our communities. And I think it's also, I think the way that we build our campaigns and the way that we do our advocacy work has to directly call out and address the assumptions that are underlying the things that we are fighting. Because that is one of the things that's really difficult, is that I can work with my colleagues to end the drug war, and then something else shows up. And we know this to be true because we've seen this with slavery, with Jim Crow, with mass incarceration, and now with electronic incarceration, with big tech, all these things have the same underlying assumption. And so it means that we have to aggressively acknowledge and account and attack the assumption that is continuing to be laid as the foundation for new systems of control and surveillance. And so I think that is I think it's the narrative, but I think the narrative has to be really explicit in pulling out the assumptions.
Can you talk a little bit about, you mentioned a couple times big tech and its role and the new Jim Crow. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because often the ankle monitor, other sorts of monitoring are thrown out there and say, hey, you're not going to jail. We're just going to charge you a couple $100s a month for an ankle monitor that will restrict your movement. You have to check in 24 hours a day, so on and so forth. Talk a little bit about that, because I think often that point is missed.
So I think what's really important, and I learned this from a formerly incarcerated person that I can't remember his name, James, and he said this at the Beyond the Bars conference. And he said, oftentimes people ask the question, I mean, like, what do you think is better, right? Like incarceration or incarceration in your home with an ankle monitor. And he said, the thing is that that's the wrong question, and that we shouldn't be comparing things to incarceration. We should be comparing things to freedom, right? So, and I think that is a really important concept, because in the assumption when we compare ankle monitors to incarceration is the assumption that incarceration is an effective strategy and that incarceration is a given. And I think that we have to push back on the assumption that is a status quo pillar that must remain. And that actually what we're trying to get to is care and prevention and freedom, right? And when you start asking those questions, then those softer kinds of incarceration don't actually look that good, right? And I think for us in drugs, this was a situation where people were like, you can be incarcerated or you can go to treatment. And both those things can suck, right? Like incarceration sucks and treatment really sucks if you don't want to be there. And so I think that this is part of the thing where the assumption that we have to underlie is that the only way to get to a different place is if we control groups of people and we punish them and we make them incarcerated, and we use carcerality as a strategy or a practice in dealing with people and complex human behaviors. And so I think one of the things that is super important is that there's a market around this. There's a huge market around, there was a market around incarceration, and now they can make more money with less capital, right? Like they don't need brick and mortar. If we're all paying rent, we're paying rent and incarcerated in the place that we paying rent. That makes their margins a lot bigger. I'm not really good at math. I didn't go to an MBA. I went to social work school for a reason, but I'm pretty sure Tracy will tell you that balance sheet looks better. And so it's really about recognizing that part of the reason why this country is based on anti-Black racism is because it makes money. Like capitalism is there's a market to us being harmed in this way. There's a market to these assumptions remaining not disrupted, and the market is just shifting, and technology is one of the biggest ways that is happening.
And going over to you, Mr. Syfax, because you got pulled into it. What is your take on this idea of, because we tried a lot of methods. We tried drug court, we tried ankle monitors, we tried deferred sentencing, adjudications, so on and so forth. What is the ideal solution? If we just elect you president tomorrow or put you in charge of criminal justice reform, what would be the ideal solution you would find that would help us to address many of these consequences and the intentionality in the system?
Yeah, Robert, if it was a silver bullet, I think somebody would have pulled that trigger a long time ago. I don't think there's a silver bullet to address our issues. And I think I can pretty much go right to the issue of healthcare that we're talking about in reference to getting help from our traumatic experience. The underlying beast with that there is we can't access healthcare. And COVID and the pandemic has taught us how bad our health system is when it comes to African Americans in our community. So once again, as we began this conversation, we talked about all the underlying issues that we face in our community. And, that's just one of them. So we have to begin to work on that. But like I said, I'm big on economics. I know what it has done for me. I know what the power of money can put me in. I'm not a fan of capitalism, but I know I need some capital to live in this country and to have proper health care and to do for my community and to do for my family. So I understand the capitalist game and I'll play it. But I also recognize, and I can give you a prime example. We had a play here in Trenton that couldn't get off the ground. It was short about $6,000. It was a play called Caves. But I already know that through the arts, we can tell a story. So what I was able to do as a successful entrepreneur was to put up the money to have that play. That play sold out 7 weeks in a row and provided the message that we need in our community through the arts. So I say, if I had a magic bullet, if I had one bullet, I think it's through the basis of economics. We can buy our houses, we can provide our food, we can educate ourselves, and we can get a good health system if we can provide the economics for ourselves. So my whole thing will be around entrepreneurship and ownership.
All right, and piggybacking on that, what would be your advice or your suggestion on for what lawyers, in particular criminal defense lawyers, can do to connect their clients who are returning citizens to the proper resources so they can excel in the market as you did? You know, many people don't come home to family support. They don't come home to savings accounts, those sorts of things. Often you're rebuilding your life from the ground up. So what are the steps people need to be taking in order to ensure they're in the best position to prosper and to benefit from the market and to pull themselves up from where they are?
That's the job of all of us, Robert. You know, one of the things I can do and talk about what I've been able to do in this 7.5 square mile town called Trenton that I live in is to work with the local politicians, work with our mayor here in Trenton that I've worked with over the past couple of years. We just established an Office of Reentry down at City Hall, where we're going to bring all the resources from all the social service agencies in this small county to bear down City Hall. When folks coming home, the criminal defense lawyers can direct them to City Hall to get those services. So I think it's on all of us to provide and make sure the space open. One of the other things we were able to do here in Trenton, they had a 7-year restriction on anyone with a criminal background record couldn't apply for a job at City Hall to even throw trash. With just the stroke of a pen, we got the mayor here in the city of Trenton to do away with that 7-year restriction, set up a committee, and now we interview guys on a case-by-case basis to get jobs with the city of Trenton. Those are the things that we can do in each and every community to help our brothers and sisters coming home. And that's what I've been able to do here in Trenton. That's what I know some of my fellow advocates have been doing all across the country. I think it starts on the ground level. These folks are coming home to our community, and they're coming home to a community near us, and we have to provide the resources for them.
Absolutely. Mr. Garrett, one of the questions that we have is, how do lawyers build the type of rapport that you mentioned between yourself and your counsel, where they can have those tough, candid conversations and can offer the best legal advice to what are often recalcitrant clients who feel that they have to tell the lawyer the story that they want them to be presented to the court instead of simply being able to have an open line of communication?
I think just going that extra mile. You know, all of us, I mean, on no matter what side of this issue we sit on, we can all sense sincerity. You know, I know when somebody's BSing me and they're just going through the motions with something. And I also know when somebody cares, when they actually care, you know, by their body language, by the type of questions they ask me, the tone that they ask me in, and everything. That's what, like I said, going back to my example, the lady that I referred to that I'm friends with now, you know, the first thing that struck me right away is she asked me a question about me to help me that had nothing to do with my case. That's going the extra mile. You know, I mean, there's no set formula or anything like that to be able to do this, but people can tell. One of the things I heard when I was getting ready to pack up and go to law school is, and it's so very true, and I've heard it repeated a couple of times, is that people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And that's true. Deep down inside, even a little bitty child that's 5 years old, a child that's 5 years old can tell when mom and daddy is really listening to them and when they're just trying to shoo them off to get them to watch cartoons to get them out of their hair. People can tell when you care. Going that extra mile for a criminal defense attorney or even a prosecutor for that matter, going that extra mile to find out what can I do to sincerely help you. This is a humanity issue. Like I said earlier, this is not an us against them type of issue. This is a problem that we have in our society where we have become desensitized to a lot of the things that go on, and we've lost that capacity to actually care about one another as human beings. If an attorney, a criminal defense attorney could do that, go that extra mile, I guarantee they will get different results. I guarantee they will develop some type of relationship where they can build up trust and be able to work with that client and partner with that client rather than directing the client.
Follow-up question for you, for also from the Q&A. Do you think that if clients were presented with all the potential negative externalities down the line, that would persuade more to go to trial and fight their cases? But concomitant with that, do you also think that that might force more people to not take a good plea because of fear of what goes on down the line and end up with one of those lengthy sentences for a case they really can't win going to trial?
I think, Robert, I think that's something that would, I mean, it's kind of hard to answer a question like that. I think that's something that would have to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. I do know that the criminal justice system is not set up to go to trial. I mean, you think we have a problem with overcrowding and court dockets being long and cases backed up and stuff like that. You start letting a lot of people start, opting to stand on their constitutional right to go to trial, and it's going to really be backed up then, and I think we would really see a problem. But I mean, there are things that can be done along the way to help the client. I mean, give them the full picture, give the client the full picture, and give them a little bit of leeway. I mean, give them a little bit of latitude to be able to participate in their own defense. I mean, ultimately, the defense lawyer is the one that has the law license and really, really knows the ins and outs and everything, but try to work to become a partner with them and let them decide. Give them the full, array of everything that's going on with the case and what the consequences might be of taking it to trial versus taking a plea agreement. Let them know what the collateral consequences would be, all of that, and give them an opportunity to actually make the decision. But I think ultimately those are the questions that can only be answered like on a case-by-case basis.
All right, question for Cassandra. What role do you think diversion and deferred adjudication programs should play in the systemic change around the issues discussed today? You mentioned, drug courts. We've mentioned mandatory rehabilitation. What should be the ideal formula that we set in place that will both address the need for criminal justice reform and the needs of the client?
I think it's important for us to think about how diversion is voluntary. I think it's really important for us to pay attention. I think one of the things that I'm really, if I had to pick one D strategy, it would be decriminalization over diversion. I think we need to start moving towards like not having the criminal legal system be a part of it. I think oftentimes when we look at drug courts, when we look at diversion, we see they do abysmally when it comes to racial other groups that are not white. The people that are most access to the help that these diversion programs offer are the people that are also already least likely to be engaged by the criminal justice system. So we're helping the same people that were more likely not going to be criminalized. And so I really think that the moment that we're in is about moving towards decriminalization. And, I do agree with Tracy around there's no silver bullet, but I think it's important for the defense community to be a part of the conversation around abolition. And I think oftentimes people get nervous about the conversation about abolition because they're like, well, we're going to take things down. What do you do about the scary people? But we're all scary people. And we need to figure out how do we have conversations about how do we build the infrastructures to deal with harm and to deal with trauma that are not rooted in the criminal legal system. And I think it's really important for us to start recognizing that we can't fix what we have. We literally cannot. As the Black people on the screen, like this system was literally created for our capture and our exploitation. You can't reform that. we need to start thinking about like what is an alternative way for us to deal with complicated situations.
And going over to Tracy, and then after that, I'm going to ask each of you for a short closing statement, and also how people can get in contact with yourself and your organizations, websites, social media, books, those sorts of things, as we get close to a close here. But for Tracy, one of the questions, I'm kind of consolidating a few questions here, is kind of, you don't know what you don't know, particularly while somebody is in custody. What information or what resources can we give them to properly prepare themselves for the reentry process, and to put themselves in the place where they can benefit from business and entrepreneurship, and getting things prepared for coming back into society?
I think self-education is a powerful tool. It's one of the tools that I used before I came home from jail. In the 1980s, I read Donald Goins when I was in prison, all the Pimp and Hustle books. When I went to jail in 1990, I started reading The Art of War and all the other business books. So I think changing one's perspective by reading different materials starts there. But I think also asking educational materials, and one of the things that I'm big on now, and that I've had the blessings of working in DC with, was being able to teach our course on tablets in prison. We're offering tablets now in prisons across the country and using them basically for all the wrong reasons, to charge people crazy email transactions, to sell music, to sell games. Here in New Jersey, we don't even use tablets for educational purposes. We use them just for that. So being able to work and change that system, whereas that we can make sure that folks are getting proper educational content on tablets that are in prisons across this country, I think is so important. So we've been advocating this for a number of years now. We continue to work in this space to make sure that we be able to do that, to be able to beam into it. And we've created that. We have a platform that can beam into any prison securely in the country through our online portal. So being able to have that access to connect in prison, to bring these educational tools in prisons, I think it starts right there.
Absolutely. And with that, we have a few minutes left. So I want each of you to take about a minute to give us some closing comments. And as I said, mention any websites, resources you think that are important, how people can follow you on social media, that sort of thing. So I'll start with you, Kevin Garrett.
Thank you, Kevin Garrett. You can reach me at garrett21.tjp@gmail.com. I am currently a commissioner on the Judicial Commission for Mental Health in the state of Texas, collaborating with judges all across the state to help them to get an inside picture of what some of their decisions from the bench look like on people like me. In closing, I'd just like to say all of us collectively should take a really close look at the front end of our problem that we're with. Once an individual is in the back of a police car, that train is leaving the station. Once they encounter a defense attorney, whoa, it is hard to stop the wheels of justice at that time. So start looking at what we can do on the front end to prevent a lot of this stuff from happening in the first place. And thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. We're going to go to Cassandra for closing statements.
So I would say today, it is being reported that Andrew Brown in North Carolina was killed. They saw the body camera footage, and the conversation includes the fact that they're using drugs as the reason why they engaged him. And this was, the day after the Derek Chauvin verdict came out, where the defense used fentanyl as a reason why George Floyd died, which was a year ago, 2 months after Breonna Taylor was killed in her bed. I think it's really important for defense attorneys to really think about their role in the criminal legal system. I think defense attorneys are important and they're doing incredible work. And as Mr. Garrett laid out, they can be great partners towards the fight for justice. But I also think that it's important for the criminal defense community to recognize that they are a part of the system, even though they are fighting it. And that they have to be on the outside working to take down the blocks. that are serving as the prisons for our communities.
Thank you so much. And finally, Tracy Syfax.
Well, first, Robert, I just want to thank you guys for having me, and thank you for this opportunity to participate on this esteemed panel. I just want to thank Kevin and Cassandra for allowing me to share this space with such fierce advocates. And I think, and I'll end with this right here because I think it's so important. Yeah, so fierce advocates is what we need. When we talk about where we are in this day and age, and she just mentioned about how this brother was shot 5 times behind drugs, how we continue to see our brothers and sisters killed daily in the street. Dr. King once said, a nation or civilization that continues to produce soft-minded men and women produces their own death on their installment plan. We got to do better. We can't be moderate Democrats. I don't know where we get this moderate Democrats from. We don't have moderate problems. We got to do better. So I'm Tracy Syfax. I can be reached at tracysyfax.com on my website or on all social media assets at Tracy Syfax and at From the Block to the Boardroom. Thank you, Monica. Thank you all for having me.
Thank you so much. Also, where can we get the book at?
The book, please. The book you can get off my website. Do not order my book from Amazon. I love Amazon, but Amazon treat me like they wrote the book. TracySyfax.com.
I want to Tracy know how to make that money. That's why I keep him around. See, we are here on this. I want to thank everybody so much. We're going to hand the program back over to Monica. It's been an outstanding presentation. We will, of course, have to do follow-ups on this. And I want to thank everybody for participating today. And again, you guys can follow me at Robert Patillo on all social media. I'm going to hand the program back over to Monica Reed.
Thank you so much, Robert, and thank you to the panel. Before I give kind of a closing, I do, in our background, we do kind of going through the chat, and I do want to address kind of 2 things that came up throughout the conversation. And one is just the humanizing language when we're referring to individuals who are formerly incarcerated, and to be very considerate, especially if you are wanting to be a part of this conversation and influence and advocate in this conversation. And this doesn't include language like ex-con or felon or convict. So if you are new to the conversation and you are unsure, then pull someone you respect to the side and have a conversation, have a meaningful conversation. But when we're talking about this work and we're involved in this work, we do need to be mindful of that language. And so if you ever are, need help in terms of how you should refer to any member of this panel, you can use the language that Robert used, Mr. Syfax, Mr. Garrett, Cassandra Federic, who is leading, one of the nation's leading organizations who are engaged in drug policy reform. Use that type of language, but please refrain if you're going to participate or join or engage in an NACDL conversation. Please use humanizing language when referring to any member of our panel. And a second conversation, again, Cassandra kind of hit it on it in her comments and at the beginning as well, when someone mentioned why they're being profiled as a white person. So we have this conversation about race and something in the criminal legal system, because I think Cassandra said it well, this was intentional. And she talked about the intentionality of the policy choices. It wasn't by accident that our policies are disproportionately impacting Black people and communities of color. It was intentional. There's a film, and you should check it out, called Racially Charged. And in that film, some of the folks who were featured just talk about how the justice system has been weaponized against communities of color. Collateral consequences are literally have replaced systems like the Jim Crow laws and Black codes as a racialized system of social control. This was not unintentional, it was intentional. And so we have these intentional conversations around race and something in the legal system, because again, it didn't happen by happenstance. These are all intentional policy choices. So we have to be intentional in our advocacy around that. So those are my 2 soapboxes. Again, I want to thank the panel, because I feel like even being involved in this work, I constantly am learning from those who we are able to feature in our panel discussions. And thank you, Robert, as always, for doing such a wonderful job. Some information has already been shared in the chat. For those who are attorneys, you should consider joining a CLE eligible. Unfortunately, this program is not CLE eligible, but you can consider joining a CLE eligible program. Our Race Matters 4 Summit is coming up in September. and it will probably, do further deep dive in a lot of the conversations that Kevin was sharing about the role of criminal defense lawyers. This was recorded, so we will provide the recording, and if you registered, you will get notified as soon as the recording is available. Again, thank you so much to our panel for just sharing your time, your expertise. Wonderful job, always constantly learning. Thank you for joining, and stay tuned to your emails. I'm sure we'll have future programming to share with you at a later date.